Inside the recovery room, reeking of antiseptic, my eldest son, Julian, leaned in and whispered venomously, "You always said I'd never be ready to run the company. Looks like we're about to find out." He has no idea that every single word of his betrayal is being recorded. The day I stand up, his empire will crumble to pieces. The day I stand up, his empire will crumble to pieces. He thinks he is inheriting a fortune, but in reality, he is signing his own confession. I truly appreciate you staying with me. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. What's your city or country? Drop a comment. Also, please note this story includes fictional elements for entertainment purposes. Any likeness to actual names or locations is coincidental, but the message shared is intended to be valuable. The last thing Arthur Sterling remembered before the world went dark was the sound of his own breathing. It had been a brutal Tuesday. 16 hours inside the glass tower of Sterling Global's Manhattan headquarters, 4 board meetings back to back, 2 acquisition calls with partners in London, and 1 argument with Julian that had left a bitter taste in Arthur's mouth, long after his son stormed out of the conference room. "You never listen." Julian had snapped his jaw tight, his eyes burning with something that Arthur had mistaken for ambition. "You built this company, and you think that gives you the right to control every single thing inside it." "I built this company," Arthur had replied, his voice the kind of low and measured that made grown men take a step back, "so that one day it would be worth something to leave behind. Don't mistake my patience for weakness, Julian." Julian had straightened his cufflinks, smoothed his jacket, and offered his father a smile so polished it could have hung in a gallery. "Of course, father," he had said. And then he walked out. Arthur had stood at the floor-to-ceiling window afterward, 62 years old, the city of New York, blazing 40 stories below him like a circuit board powered by ambition and money. He had built all of it, every deal, every tower, every zero on the balance sheet. And yet standing there watching the lights flicker in the cold December air, something hollow stirred inside his chest, a feeling he did not have a name for and refused to examine too closely. He left the office at 10:47 that night. His driver Thomas held the door of the black sedan open with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been doing it for 11 years. Arthur slid into the back seat, without a word, loosened his tie, and closed his eyes. The car moved through midtown traffic, sleek and silent, cutting south toward his penthouse on the Upper West Side. Arthur's mind was already moving to tomorrow, the Singapore deal, the quarterly report, the conversation he needed to have with Robert Harrison about restructuring the legal team. He never made it home. It started as a subtle wrongness, a softness in the brake pedal when Thomas eased toward a red light on Riverside Drive. Then the pedal sank all the way to the floor and came back with nothing. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas's voice cracked with panic. "The brakes, they're not—" "Pump them!" Arthur said sharply, sitting up straight, every nerve in his body firing at once. "Pump the brakes, Thomas, now!" "I'm trying, sir. I'm trying. They're gone. There's nothing—" The sedan accelerated down the slope of Riverside Drive, the engine screaming, the tires shrieking against wet asphalt. Arthur grabbed the door handle with both hands, his knuckles going white, his heart slamming against his ribs like it was trying to break free. Headlights smeared into streaks of white and yellow. A horn blared somewhere to his left. Thomas yanked the wheel and the world tilted sideways, and then there was a sound, like the whole universe folding in on itself, metal and glass, and silence all at once. Then nothing. When Arthur woke, he could not move. Not a finger, not an eyelid, not the corner of his mouth. He lay in what he understood to be a bed, surrounded by the steady, mechanical rhythm of a ventilator, breathing for him, and the soft, persistent beeping of monitors, tracking his heart. The air smelled of antiseptic, and something faintly floral, a cleaning product perhaps, or someone's perfume from the hallway. His mind, however, was razor sharp. He thought, "I am alive." He thought, "I cannot move." He thought, "What is wrong with me?" The doctors came and went in the early hours. He heard their voices through the door, and then directly above him, clinical, efficient, stripped of warmth, the way only medical professionals and executives could manage. Deep coma, one said. Brain activity is minimal. We'll run another scan in the morning, but the prognosis at this stage is not encouraging. Arthur wanted to scream. He wanted to grab the doctor by the collar and shout that he was right there, that he could hear every single word, that minimal brain activity was the most catastrophically wrong assessment any human being had ever made in the history of medicine, but his body simply refused. It lay still and obedient and utterly useless, while his mind raged inside it like a caged animal. Then the door opened again, and Arthur heard footsteps he would have recognized anywhere. The deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who believed he already owned the room before he entered it. Julian. Arthur's heart rate spiked on the monitor, and deep inside the prison of his own body, Arthur Sterling felt the first cold finger of true fear reach into his chest and squeeze. Julian Sterling did not come alone. He brought with him the faint scent of whiskey and cologne, the same brand Arthur had given him for Christmas 3 years ago, and the low murmur of a phone call he was finishing as he pushed through the door. Yes, I've seen the transfer confirmation, Julian said into the phone, his voice smooth and unbothered, the voice of a man conducting ordinary business. Tell Silas the remaining payment clears Thursday. He did his job. Make sure he disappears for a while. A pause. I don't care where he goes. Montana, Mexico, I don't care. Just make sure he's not in New York when the questions start. The call ended with a soft click. Arthur lay completely still, every nerve in his body, screaming, his mind running so fast it felt like it might tear itself apart. Silas. He turned the name over carefully. Silas. He did not know a Silas, but Julian did, and Julian had just paid him. And Julian was standing at his father's bedside with the relaxed posture of a man who had already won. Julian exhaled slowly, pulling a chair close to the bed and sitting down. For a long moment he simply looked at his father, or rather looked at the body his father now inhabited, the tubes and wires, and the slow mechanical rise and fall of the chest that the ventilator produced. Well, Julian said quietly, and there was something almost tender in his voice that made Arthur's blood run cold. You always said I'd never be ready to run Sterling on my own. Looks like we're going to find out. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and lowered his voice as though sharing a confidence. Here's the thing, Father. I don't need you dead. Dead is messy. Dead means lawyers and contested wills, and Audrey crying in courtrooms, and reporters digging through everything. Dead is a problem. He tilted his head slightly. But this is perfect. You're breathing. Your heart is beating. The machines say you're alive. And that means every signature I put on those transfer documents carries your authority as long as Dr. Bennett keeps telling the board you're in no condition to make decisions. Arthur wanted to roar. He wanted to lunge from the bed and wrap his hands around his son's throat and shake him until something real fell out. Instead, the ventilator breathed for him. The monitor beeped. His body betrayed him with its perfect stillness. Julian stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, hands clasped behind his back in an unconscious mimicry of his father's own habit. 200 million, Julian murmured almost to himself and let out a short laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. That's what I owe. Between the Cayman accounts and Vegas and Macau and that disaster in Singapore, 200 million. And another 50 to people who don't send lawyers when they want their money back. His voice tightened for just a moment, a crack in the polished surface. You have no idea the pressure I've been under. No idea. He turned back to the bed. His eyes moved over his father's face with something that might have been guilt, if it had been allowed to fully form, but Julian crushed it quickly, the way he crushed most inconvenient things. I tried to tell you, you know, he said, and now his voice carried a sharp edge of genuine bitterness. 3 years ago, I came to you and told you the Singapore expansion was bleeding us dry, and you looked me in the eye and said I didn't understand the long game. Your words. I didn't understand the long game. He let out a breath through his nose. So I found my own game, He reached into his jacket and produced a folded set of documents. Arthur could hear the crisp sound of heavy paper being smoothed against the bedside table, the click of a pen. "First transfer authorization," Julian said quietly, signing with slow, deliberate strokes. "Sterling Pacific Holdings to Cayman, account number 7, 30 million. Another document, another signature. Sterling Media Assets, partial divestment, 18 million. He capped the pen with a soft snap. "Dr. Bennett will file these with the board tomorrow morning as emergency asset protection measures authorized under the incapacity clause." He slipped the documents back inside his jacket. Julian looked down at his father one final time, and in that moment, something shifted in his expression, not regret exactly, but something older and more complicated, the look of a man who has crossed a line and already knows he can never come back. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said, and then almost inaudibly, but not sorry enough to stop. The door closed behind him with a soft final click. Arthur lay in the ringing silence of the room, the ventilator breathing steadily for his useless body, the monitors charting the furious rhythm of a heart that refused to surrender. 30 million, 18 million, Silas, Dr. Bennett, the incapacity clause. Every word carved itself into his memory with the precision of a blade. His son had not come to grieve him. His son had come to bury him alive, and somewhere beneath the fury and the disbelief and the crushing weight of a betrayal 32 years in the making, Arthur Sterling felt something else begin to form cold and hard and absolute as a diamond pressed from the darkest kind of pressure. He was going to get out of this bed, and when he did, Julian would wish the accident had finished the job. They came in waves. The first arrived at 9:15 the following morning, a delegation of 3 men in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, moving through the corridors of Mercy General Hospital's 12th floor, with the quiet urgency of people who had somewhere more important to be. Arthur heard them before he saw them. The confident strike of leather soles against linoleum, the low exchange of voices being carefully modulated for a hospital environment, while still projecting authority. The door swung open. Arthur recognized the voice immediately. Richard Paulson, Sterling Global's Chief Operating Officer, a man Arthur had hired 14 years ago and promoted twice. Lord Richard said softly, and Arthur heard genuine shock in his voice. Shock that lasted approximately 4 seconds before it was replaced by something more practical. "He looks smaller than I expected." "They always do," said the second voice. That was Franklin Cross, head of Sterling's real estate division, a man who wore his greed like a second skin and had somehow convinced himself it was ambition. "Has Dr. Bennett given a final timeline?" 72 hours for another assessment," Richard said. "But between us, Franklin Bennett doesn't expect improvement. The scans are not good." Franklin exhaled slowly. Arthur could almost hear the man's mind calculating. "Then we need to talk about the Singapore portfolio. If Arthur is genuinely incapacitated, those contracts need a signature with authority behind it. Julian's already made noises about stepping in, but the board is divided." "The board is always divided," said the third voice, Gerald Marsh, Sterling's longest-serving director, 70 years old and sharp as a paper cut. "What the board needs is clarity. What it currently has is a man on a ventilator and a son who smells like he spent the weekend in Las Vegas." Richard let out a short, uncomfortable laugh. "Gerald." "I'm not wrong, and you know it," Gerald said flatly. "Julian Sterling has the impulse control of a 20-year-old with a credit card." Arthur knew it. That's why he never formally named the boy as successor. A pause. Arthur heard the scrape of a chair. "The question is what happens to the voting shares if Arthur doesn't recover, because whoever controls those shares controls the company." "There's a daughter," Franklin said. "Audrey," Richard confirmed. 24, finance degree. Smart girl apparently, but she's never held a real position in the company. Julian's had her sidelined for 2 years. "Then for all practical purposes," Gerald said, "the shares are in play." They stayed for 11 minutes. Arthur counted every one of them. They stood around his bed, discussing him the way men discuss a company in receivership, clinically, efficiently, with the practiced detachment of people who have learned to separate sentiment from strategy. Not one of them spoke to him. Not one of them touched his hand or said his name with anything resembling warmth. They were not visiting a man, they were surveying an asset. When they left the room filled with a silence that pressed down on Arthur's chest like a physical weight. But the morning was not finished. By noon, 4 more visitors had come and gone. Margaret Holloway, whose nonprofit Arthur had funded for 6 years, swept in wearing a black dress that struck Arthur as premature and spent 8 minutes taking photographs on her phone before telling the nurse outside that she was absolutely devastated. David Carr Chen, Arthur's golf partner of 12 years, stepped in long enough to say such a shame, twice, and check his watch once. A woman Arthur barely recognized, the wife of some ambassador he had met at a gala 3 years ago, arrived with flowers, set them on the windowsill, and conducted an almost entirely one-sided conversation about her upcoming vacation in Tuscany. Each one of them left a little more of Arthur's faith in humanity on the floor behind them. But it was the last visitor of the afternoon that cut the deepest. Patricia Walsh had been Arthur's closest friend outside of business for nearly 20 years. They had met at a charity auction, bonded over a shared contempt for small talk, and built a friendship that Arthur had genuinely believed was unconditional. She had called herself his family when he had none left to speak of. She sat beside him now, and for one brief, aching moment, Arthur thought she might simply be there. Just there. Present in the way that costs nothing and means everything. "Oh, Arthur," she said softly, and her voice trembled in a way that sounded almost real. Then her phone buzzed and she glanced at it, and her voice changed, becoming lower, conspiratorial. She was calling someone. "Yes, I'm here now. He looks terrible, honestly. I don't think he's coming back from this one." A pause. "Well, that's what I'm saying. If the penthouse goes into the estate, we should talk to the building manager before it hits the open market, because those units never... Yes, exactly. Call me when you're out of your meeting." She hung up, patted Arthur's hand once with the brisk efficiency of someone checking a task off a list, and left. The door clicked shut. Arthur lay in the ruins of 30 years of carefully constructed relationships, and felt something inside him give way, not break exactly, but loosen like a load-bearing wall that had been quietly rotting for years, finally showing the first visible crack. He had built an empire. He had filled boardrooms and ballrooms and charity galas with people who smiled at his name and laughed at his jokes and called him friend. And not one of them, not one had looked at him today like he was still a man. The room grew darker as the afternoon faded. The monitors beeped, the ventilator breathed, and somewhere outside in the hallway, a cleaning cart rattled against the floor. A small, unremarkable sound that Arthur would later understand had been the first note of the only piece of music that actually mattered. The cleaning cart arrived at 6:47 in the evening. Arthur had memorized the sound of it over the past 2 days. The slightly uneven rattle of the left front wheel, the soft clink of spray bottles knocking against each other, the quiet squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum that preceded it by about 4 steps. He had come to recognize it the way a man adrift at sea learns to recognize the sound of a particular boat engine, not because it promised rescue, simply because it was consistent. In a world that had revealed itself to be made almost entirely of performance and pretense, consistency had become the most radical thing Arthur Sterling had ever encountered. The door opened, and she came in. He could not see her, but he had built a picture of her from sound and sensation alone. She moved carefully, methodically, without the theatrical hustle of someone performing competence for an audience. She set the cart just inside the door. She pulled on gloves with a practiced snap. She began at the far corner of the room and worked toward the window, her cloth moving in slow, even strokes, across surfaces that were already clean because she cleaned them anyway. She hummed something low and shapeless under her breath, not quite a song, more like the sound a person makes when they are thinking about something pleasant and have forgotten they are making any sound at all. Arthur lay still and listened, and felt for the first time in 2 days that the room contained something other than calculation. She reached his bedside and paused. He heard a small intake of breath, not alarmed, more like the sound of someone noticing a detail that others had overlooked, then the soft sound of water being poured, a cloth being wrung, and then with a gentleness that was so unexpected, it hit Arthur somewhere behind his sternum, like a closed fist. A warm, damp cloth touched his forehead and moved slowly across his face. Nobody had done that. In 2 days of doctors and nurses and executives and so-called friends, nobody had done that. She wiped his face with the careful attention of someone who understood that dignity does not stop mattering when consciousness is in question. She moved to his lips, cracked and dry from 2 days of the ventilator, and he heard the soft sound of a container opening, something warm and faintly herbal, being dabbed with the corner of a cloth. Rice water, he would later learn, something her grandmother had used. "There you go," she said quietly to nobody in particular, or perhaps to him. "That looks better." Arthur's chest tightened so hard he was certain the heart monitor would betray him. But it beeped on, steady and indifferent. She was gathering her supplies when the door slammed open. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Julian's voice filled the room like cold water, thrown on a fire, sudden and extinguishing. Arthur heard the woman's cart knock against the wall as she startled the rattle of bottles, the sharp intake of her breath. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was just cleaning the room and I noticed his lips were—" "I can see what you were doing," Julian said, and his voice carried that particular register of contempt that wealthy men deploy against people they have decided do not count. "You were touching my father. You were putting things on his face. Do you have any idea who this man is?" "Yes, sir," she said. "He's a patient, and his lips were cracked and—" "He is Arthur Sterling," Julian said, and Arthur could hear him moving closer to the woman, using his height and his suit and his authority the way a weapon is used. "He is not your concern. Your concern is the floor and the surfaces, and whatever else your job description covers. Do you understand? Me, do not touch him again." A pause. Arthur wanted to scream. He wanted to sit up and look Julian in the eye and say, "This woman has done more for me in 10 minutes than you have done in 32 years. But his body held its useless peace. "I understand," the woman said. Her voice was steady, quieter than before, but steady. "Good," Julian said. "Now finish up and get out." The door swung open again, and Julian's footsteps retreated down the hall, already back on his phone, his voice resuming its smooth transactional rhythm before he had even cleared the doorway. The woman did not leave immediately. Arthur heard her collect herself, one slow breath in, one slow breath out, the sound of a person who has learned to absorb indignity without letting it become injury. Then she moved back to his bedside. She was not supposed to. Julian had just explicitly told her not to. But she picked up the cloth anyway and finished what she had started, dabbing the last of the rice water across his lower lip with the same unhurried care as before. "Don't you worry about him," she said softly, and her voice was warm and a little rough around the edges, the voice of someone who had worked hard for a long time and was not broken by it. "Somebody's got to look after you properly. Might as well be me." She gathered her cart and left. Arthur lay in the dark of his own body and felt something shift, small and seismic, at the same time the way a single degree of temperature change can be the difference between water and ice. He had spent 62 years measuring people by their ambition, their intelligence, their capacity to generate value. He had never once considered that the most valuable thing a person could offer another was simply the willingness to treat them like they mattered. He did not know her name. He did not know anything about her life. But in the cold arithmetic of everything he had witnessed over the past 2 days, her 10 minutes of quiet care outweighed every boardroom and ballroom and penthouse conversation he had ever had. The monitor beeped. The ventilator breathed. And somewhere down the hallway, the cleaning cart rattled softly as it moved on to the next room, carrying with it the only warmth Arthur Sterling had felt in longer than he could honestly remember. "I am deeply grateful for your presence on this journey to reclaim justice. To let me know you're still watching and supporting Arthur, please leave a comment with the number 1 or the word ready right below this video. Also, please note the following scenes include certain fictional elements added to heighten the drama. If you prefer to seek out only unadorned facts, you may stop the video here and choose other content that better suits your needs. He heard the small footsteps first. They were nothing like the footsteps Arthur had cataloged over the past 2 days. Not the confident stride of executives, not the measured pace of doctors, not the deliberate click of Julian's Italian leather shoes. These were light and slightly uneven, the footsteps of someone who was trying very hard to be quiet and not entirely succeeding, pausing every few steps as though checking to make sure no one was watching. The door opened with a soft push. A small voice said, "Hello, are you sleeping?" Arthur felt something loosen in his chest. Not the sharp loosening of pain, but the slow, aching loosening of something that had been held too tight for too long. The child stepped closer. Arthur heard the soft drag of sneakers on the floor, the rustling of what sounded like a backpack being set down, and then the sound he would remember for the rest of his life, the scrape of a chair being pulled close to the bed, and 2 small hands folding themselves on top of the mattress near his own. "My mama says I'm not supposed to come in here," the boy said conversationally, as though this fact was mildly interesting but not particularly binding. "She says you're a very important man, and I should give you your privacy. But I told her that important people are the ones who need someone to talk to the most, because everyone around them is too scared to say anything real." Arthur wanted to laugh. He could not remember the last time he had genuinely wanted to laugh. "My name is Leo," the boy continued. "I'm 7 years old, and I want to be an artist when I grow up. My mama says I should also have a backup plan, but I told her Michelangelo didn't have a backup plan, and he painted the Sistine Chapel." A brief pause. "She said that was different. I don't think it's that different." The boy shifted in his chair. Arthur heard him unzip the backpack and rummage through it, with the focused energy of someone searching for something specific. "I brought my sketchbook," Leo announced. "I'm going to draw while I talk to you. My teacher says I do my best thinking when my hands are busy. She's probably right. Most of the time, teachers are right, even when you don't want them to be." He began to draw the soft scratch of pencil on paper, filling the room with a quiet industry that Arthur found, to his own surprise, deeply comforting. "Can I ask you something?" Leo said. "You don't have to answer. I know you're sleeping. But my mama told me once that people who are sleeping can still hear things, kind of like how you can hear thunder in a dream, even when you're not awake. So I figure you might be able to hear me, even if you can't say anything back." He paused, pencil still moving. "Do you think bad people know they're bad? Like, do they wake up in the morning and think I am a bad person today? I will do bad things. Or do they think they're doing the right thing and they're just wrong about what the right thing is?" Arthur turned the question over in his mind with genuine attention. It was, he thought, a more sophisticated question than most of the ones he had been asked in 62 years of boardrooms and negotiations. "I think about that sometimes," Leo said, "because of my papa. He left when I was 3. Mama doesn't talk about him much, but I know he hurt her. And I wonder if he knew that. I wonder if he ever thought about it." The pencil stopped for a moment. "I think maybe some people are just too scared to look at what they're doing clearly. Like if they really saw it, they'd have to change, and changing is hard." He resumed drawing. "Anyway," he said, brightening perceptibly, "I made you something. It's not finished yet, but I wanted to show you the idea." Arthur heard him tear a page carefully from the sketchbook. "I drew a man standing on top of a mountain. He looks really strong and really tired at the same time. Mama says that's what courage looks like, strong and tired together. I put it on your table so you can see it when you wake up." The paper rustled as Leo set it down. He stayed for another 20 minutes, narrating his drawing, asking questions he did not expect answers, to filling the sterile room with the particular kind of light that only completely unself-conscious people carry with them. At some point, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small stuffed bear, setting it on the chair beside him. "This is Captain," he said. "He's my best friend. He's been everywhere with me. I'm going to leave him here with you tonight so you're not alone. He's good company. He stood up, stretched with the uninhibited physicality of small children, and hoisted his backpack onto his shoulders. I'll come back tomorrow, he announced with complete certainty, as though the universe had confirmed this scheduling, and he was simply passing the information along. Sleep well, Mr. Important Man. The door swung open, and the universe, in its infinite sense of timing, delivered Julian Sterling into the room at exactly that moment. Julian stopped short, staring down at the small boy with an expression of cold irritation. What are you doing in here? Where's your mother? Leo looked up at Julian with the frank, unintimidated gaze of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of expensive suits. She's cleaning the 4th floor, he said. I was visiting. This is not a visiting room for children, Julian said sharply. Get out, and take that ridiculous toy with you. Leo looked at the stuffed bear on the chair, his chin lifted slightly. I'm leaving Captain here, he said firmly, so the man isn't lonely. Julian's jaw tightened. He pointed at the door. Out! Now! Leo picked up his backpack, cast one last look at Arthur's bed, and walked out, with his head held with a dignity that put every executive Arthur had seen that week to absolute shame. Julian watched him go, then turned and looked at his father with an expression that had shed all pretense of grief. Pathetic? He said. Some janitor's kid wandering the halls. He straightened his cuffs and walked to the window, pulling out his phone. Bennett called. The board meeting is confirmed for Friday. By Saturday morning, Sterling Pacific will be mine. He left without looking back. The room settled into quiet. On the chair beside Arthur's bed, the small stuffed bear sat upright, its glassy eyes aimed steadily at the door. The room settled into quiet. On the chair beside Arthur's bed, the small stuffed bear sat upright, its glassy eyes aimed steadily at the door. And on the bedside table, half hidden beneath the edge of a folded blanket, Maria's phone lay face down and silent, its screen, dark its voice memo application running its microphone open to the room. Every word Julian Sterling had just spoken had been recorded. Dr. Thomas Bennett arrived at 7:15 in the morning. Arthur knew it was him before the door fully opened. Bennett had a particular way of entering a room unhurried, almost leisurely, the walk of a man who had convinced himself that his presence was inherently reassuring. His shoes were soft-soled, his movements quiet, and he carried with him the faint chemical smell of the laboratory that no amount of cologne could entirely mask. Good morning, Mr. Sterling, Bennett said pleasantly, as though Arthur might respond, as though this were a routine checkup and not something else entirely. Arthur heard him set his bag on the table, the zip of a medical case, the clink of glass against metal, the practiced sounds of a man preparing something with great care. Your vitals look stable, Bennett continued, snapping on latex gloves with a crisp double pop. Heart rate is good. Brain activity remains consistent with our assessment. He paused, and Arthur heard the unmistakable sound of a syringe being drawn, the soft pull of a plunger, the tap of a finger against the barrel to clear air bubbles. I'm going to administer a mild sedative, just to ensure you remain comfortable and undisturbed. Julian wants the board meeting to proceed without any complications. Without any complications. Arthur felt the needle slide into his IV line with a precision that was almost surgical in its casualness. A faint warmth began to move up his arm, almost immediately spreading through his shoulder and into his chest, like ink dropped into water, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. No, Arthur thought, no. He had never been a man who prayed. 62 years of building empires from nothing had left him with a theology that centered entirely on human will and the ruthless application of intelligence. He had not asked God for anything since he was 9 years old, and his mother was dying in a county hospital, and nobody came. But in that moment, with the sedative moving through his bloodstream, like a tide coming in, Arthur Sterling prayed. He prayed with the desperate, graceless urgency of a man who has run out of every other option. He prayed not with words, but with every molecule of will he possessed, every fiber of consciousness he had left pushing back against the chemical darkness, the way a man pushes against a door that something enormous is trying to force open from the other side. Stay awake, he told himself. Stay here. If you go under now, you do not know when you come back. If you come back. The warmth reached his neck. His thoughts began to slow and blur at the edges, the sharp clarity of the past 2 days softening like a photograph left in sunlight. He thought of Audrey. He thought of her at 7 years old, sitting on the floor of his office building, towers out of his business cards, while he took calls, looking up at him occasionally with those serious dark eyes that saw more than any child's eyes should. He thought of the last real conversation they had had 3 months ago, a Sunday dinner that had lasted 40 minutes, before his phone pulled him away, and the way her face had arranged itself into the careful, neutral expression she had learned to wear. Around him, the expression that meant she had stopped expecting more. He thought of that expression, and something in his chest cracked open like old wood. Stay awake. The warmth was at his jaw now. His thoughts were narrowing the edges of consciousness, pulling inward the way the edges of a fire pull inward when the fuel runs low. He could feel the sedative reaching for the last alert part of him, that small, fierce core that had driven him through 62 years of deals and disasters and decisions that lesser men would not have made. And then he heard it. From somewhere down the hallway, faint, barely audible over the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator, a woman's voice singing. It was not a performance. It was not meant to be heard. It was the kind of singing that happens when a person is alone with their work, when the music is less about sound than about staying sane, about keeping the spirit company through a long and unglamorous shift. The melody was simple, something that sounded like it had been handed down, rather than learned, a lullaby or a hymn, or the kind of song that lives in the bones of people who come from places where music was the one thing that could not be taken away. Maria. The name cut through the sedative fog like a blade through gauze. Arthur seized on that voice with everything he had left. He wrapped his consciousness around it, the way a drowning man wraps his hands around a rope, not gracefully, not carefully, just desperately and completely. He listened to every note, every slight imperfection, the way her voice dropped on certain syllables and rose on others, the warmth in it that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with character. He pushed back against the darkness. His heart rate spiked on the monitor, just slightly, just enough. His fingers contracted once, barely perceptibly, against the bed sheet. The sedative was still there, heavy and insistent, but it had not won. Not yet. Bennett paused on his way out, checking the monitor. Arthur heard him make a small sound somewhere between satisfaction and indifference, and then the door closed behind him. In the hallway, Maria's voice continued moving slowly away down the corridor as she worked the sound, fading by degrees, until Arthur could no longer make out the melody, only the faint impression of it, the ghost of warmth it left behind. But it was enough. He was still here, still conscious, still furious and frightened, and entirely stubbornly alive. He had one day left before the board meeting, one day to find a way out of the prison of his own body, one day to stop a theft 32 years in the making. Arthur Sterling had built an empire in less time than that. He got to work. Maria Santos had learned a long time ago not to expect anything from the world. Not cruelty, not kindness, just the steady, neutral fact of it grinding forward, regardless of what any individual person wanted or deserved. She had learned this at 14 when her father left, relearned it at 26 when Leo's father did the same, and confirmed it every day since in the accumulated small indignities of a life spent cleaning up after people who would never learn her name. So when she pushed her cart through the door of room 1214 at 6:40 in the evening, she was not expecting anything. She was expecting to clean the room, check on the patient, the way she always checked on the patients, whether she was supposed to or not, and go home to Leo, who would be waiting with his sketchbook and his questions, and his absolute certainty that she was the most important person in the world. She lifted the container of warm rice water from the lower shelf of the cart. She had made a fresh batch that afternoon the same way her grandmother had made it, slow simmered, with a little salt and a little ginger, because she had noticed his lips again this morning, and the dryness had not improved, and regardless of what that sharp-suited son of his had said to her yesterday, she was not the kind of woman who could look at suffering and walk past it. She approached the bed. "Good evening," she said softly, the way she always said it, because she believed what she had told Leo, that people in deep sleep could still hear things, still feel things, still know whether they were alone or accompanied in the dark. "I brought something for your lips again. I know you can't tell me if it helps, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway because that's just how I am." She dipped the cloth and leaned forward carefully. His hand moved. It was not a twitch or an involuntary reflex. It was a deliberate, controlled movement, 5 fingers closing around her wrist with a grip that was weak by any normal standard, and yet felt in that moment like the most powerful thing she had ever felt in her life. The container slipped from Maria's other hand and hit the floor with a hollow clatter, rice water spreading across the linoleum in a quiet pool. Her heart slammed into her ribs so hard she actually pressed her free hand to her chest. Her breath left her in a single stunned exhale. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, oh my God." The hand around her wrist tightened once gently but unmistakably, and Maria forced herself to look at the face of the man in the bed. Arthur Sterling's eyes were open, not the unfocused half-open eyes of someone in a vegetative state, not the glassy vacancy that Dr. Bennett's reports described with such clinical confidence. These eyes were sharp and dark and completely terrifyingly alert, the eyes of a man who had been awake for 3 days, watching and listening and cataloging everything, waiting for exactly this moment. Maria's legs went weak beneath her. She grabbed the bed rail with her free hand to keep from going down entirely, her knees shaking so hard she could hear the soft knock of them against the metal frame. "Don't scream," Arthur said. His voice was barely a voice at all, a raw, papery rasp that sounded like it was being dragged over gravel, the voice of someone who had not spoken in 3 days, and was spending what felt like enormous effort on every syllable. But the authority in it was absolute. Even wrecked and barely audible, it was unmistakably the voice of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. Maria pressed her free hand over her mouth and did not scream. "Good," he rasped. "Don't call anyone, not yet." His eyes moved to the door, checking it was closed, then back to her face. "What's your name?" She swallowed hard. Her hand was still shaking against her mouth. "Maria," she managed. "Maria Santos. I work here. I clean the—" "I know who you are," Arthur said, and something shifted in his expression. Something that in another man, in another context, might have been called tenderness. "You're the one who's been taking care of me." Maria felt her eyes fill without warning, the tears arriving before she had given them permission, hot and sudden and completely unstoppable. She blinked hard, and 2 of them escaped and ran down her face, and she felt foolish and overwhelmed and entirely unable to do anything about either feeling. Your lips were dry," she said, her voice cracking on the last word. "I just didn't want you to be uncomfortable." Arthur looked at her for a long moment. His grip on her wrist loosened, but did not release entirely. Not a restraint, just a connection, the grip of a man who had not been touched with kindness in a very long time, and was not ready to let go of it yet. "Maria," he said, carefully, each word costing him something, "I need to tell you something important. I need you to listen to all of it before you decide what to do. Can you do that?" She wiped her face quickly with the back of her hand, straightened her spine, and looked at him with eyes that were still bright with tears, but steady underneath them. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." "My son arranged the accident," Arthur said. "He paid a man to cut the brake line on my car. He has a doctor on his payroll who has been falsifying my medical reports. He is using my incapacity to drain assets from my company. And tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock he is meeting with my board of directors to formalize a transfer of power that will leave nothing for my daughter." Maria stared at him. The tears on her face had dried. Her expression had moved through shock and disbelief and arrived somewhere that looked remarkably like controlled fury. "Your daughter," she said. "Audrey, 24 years old. The only person in that company who has never wanted anything from me except for me to show up. His jaw tightened, and something passed across his face. Not quite pain, but the territory adjacent to it, the land where regret lives. I haven't been good at that, showing up, but I intend to start. Maria looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out a phone. Old scratched its screen, cracked along one corner, and held it out toward him. "Tell me her number," Maria said, her voice steady and quiet and absolutely certain. "I'll call her right now." Arthur felt something in his chest give way entirely. Not breaking, but opening the way a window opens after a long winter, suddenly and with a rush of cold, clean air that shocks the lungs and reminds them what breathing is actually for. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way he had not meant anything in 30 years. The number came out of him slowly. Arthur's voice was still barely functional, a dry, cracked thing that kept threatening to give out entirely, and each digit cost him a visible effort, his brow furrowing with concentration as he pulled the sequence from memory with the same deliberate precision he had once used to recite acquisition figures in quarterly meetings. Maria entered each number as he gave it her fingers, moving carefully over the cracked screen, her lips pressed together in concentration. When he finished, she looked up at him, her dark eyes steady, despite the fact that her hands had not entirely stopped trembling since he first opened his eyes. "Should I call now?" she asked. "Wait, Arthur said. He needed a moment. Not because he was afraid, or rather not only because he was afraid, but because once this call was made, everything that followed would be irreversible. He had spent 3 days in this bed, listening to his empire being dismantled, and his dignity being stripped, and he had endured it with the frozen patience of a man who had no other choice. But the moment Audrey's phone rang, the war began, and wars in Arthur Sterling's experience never ended without cost. He thought of Audrey's face, that careful, neutral expression she had learned to wear around him. He thought of 30 years of phone calls cut short and dinners abandoned, and promises made and quietly broken, 30 years of choosing the company over the child, until the child had simply learned to need him less. His chest tightened so hard it hurt in a way that had nothing to do with the accident. "Call her," he said. Maria pressed the call button and held the phone toward him. It rang 3 times, each one stretching long and thin in the quiet room, and then the line opened, and a young woman's voice said, "Hello? Who is this? Audrey?" Arthur's voice broke on her name, just fractured straight down the middle the way old timber breaks suddenly and completely, with a sound that seemed too loud for the size of the room, a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Then, "Dad!" The word hit Arthur somewhere below the sternum and did not stop. He closed his eyes. "Yes," he managed. "It's me." "Oh my God!" Audrey's voice cracked wide open, the careful composure she had inherited from him shattering in an instant, and Arthur heard her crying, not delicate tears, not polite sniffling, but real crying. The ragged, gasping kind that a person cannot control, or perform the kind that comes from a place that has been under pressure for a very long time. "Oh my God, Dad, I thought they said you were Dr. Bennett told us." "Bennett is lying," Arthur said. "Listen to me, Audrey. I need you to stop crying and listen to me. Can you do that?" A shaky breath, then another. "Yes," she said, her voice still wet, but firming up the way his daughter's voice always firmed up when she decided something mattered enough to be strong for. "Yes, I'm listening." "I've been conscious since the 3rd day," Arthur said. "I've heard everything. Julian arranged the accident. He paid someone named Silas Black to cut the brake line on my car. Bennett is on his payroll. He's been filing false neurological assessments with the board and keeping me sedated to prevent recovery. Julian is using guardianship documents to drain Sterling's assets. I've counted at least 2 transfer authorizations already. There will be more." The silence on the other end of the line was the silence of someone absorbing something enormous and refusing to fall apart while they did it. "How much?" Audrey said finally. "At least 48 million in the first 2 days," Arthur said. And there's a board meeting tomorrow at 9. Julian intends to formalize the transfer of power before anyone has time to challenge it. Another pause. He could hear her breathing fast and controlled the breathing of someone running through options at speed. Elias, she said more to herself than to him. I need to call Elias. Your friend the investigator. Former federal agent, Audrey said, and her voice had shifted completely. Now the tears were gone, replaced by something cool and focused and precise that made Arthur feel, for the first time in 3 days, that things might actually be survivable. He owes me a favor. Several favors, actually. A beat. Dad, are you safe right now? Is there anyone with you? Arthur looked at Maria, who was standing at the foot of his bed, with her arms folded across her chest, and her chin set at an angle that communicated, with perfect clarity, that she was not going anywhere. There's someone with me, he said. Her name is Maria Santos. She works in the hospital. She's the one who called you. He paused. She's been taking care of me. He stopped. The words that were actually true felt too large for the state of his voice. He settled for, she's trustworthy. Maria. Audrey's voice warmed instantly the way it warmed for people she had decided to love, which she did quickly and completely, and without reservation, a quality she had not gotten from him. Thank you. Thank you for taking care of him. Maria unfolded her arms and pressed one hand briefly over her mouth, her eyes going bright again. She took a quick breath through her nose and blinked hard, and managed a small, slightly unsteady smile. He looked like he needed it, she said, her voice rougher than usual. I need you to come to the hospital, Arthur said to Audrey, but not through the main entrance. Julian has people watching, I don't know how many. Come through the service entrance on West 54th. Maria will make sure you get up. Elias and I will be there by midnight, Audrey said. Don't let anyone else in that room. Don't react to anything Bennett or Julian does. Just hold on. I've been holding on for 3 days, Arthur said dryly. A sound came through the phone, then half laugh, half sob, the particular sound of someone feeling two enormous things at exactly the same moment. I know, Audrey said, her voice cracking again at the edges. I know you have. I'm coming, Dad. I'm coming right now. The call ended. Arthur lay back against the pillow, exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something alone for too long, and has finally, at tremendous cost, put it down. His eyes were wet. He did not bother pretending otherwise. Maria moved quietly to the window and looked out at the Manhattan skyline, giving him a moment that she understood he needed without being asked. The city blazed 40 stories below, indifferent and magnificent, completely unaware that in a hospital room on the 12th floor, the most important war Arthur Sterling had ever fought had just officially begun. She sounds like a good girl, Maria said finally without turning around. She's better than that, Arthur said. She's better than me? Maria turned and looked at him then, and her expression was not pity or agreement, or any of the diplomatic responses available to her. It was something simpler and more honest than any of those things. Well, she said, you've still got time to change that. They came at 11:58. Maria heard them first, 2 sets of footsteps moving quietly through the service corridor, the kind of quiet that is deliberate rather than natural, the practiced quiet of people who understand the difference between being unseen and being unnoticed. She was waiting at the stairwell door on the 12th floor, her cleaning cart positioned in the hallway, as cover her heart, beating considerably faster than she would have liked. The door opened, and Audrey Sterling stepped through. She was 24 years old, and she looked in that moment nothing like the polished finance graduate whose photograph appeared occasionally in the business supplements beside articles about her father's company. She was wearing dark clothes, her hair pulled back without ceremony, and her eyes dark and sharp, and unmistakably her father's were red around the edges, in a way that told Maria she had been crying in the car and had decided to be finished with it before she arrived. Behind her came a man Maria did not recognize, tall, lean, with the kind of stillness that suggested he had learned to conserve his energy for moments that actually required it. He was carrying a laptop bag and scanning the corridor with the automatic vigilance of someone for whom awareness of exits and threats had become as involuntary as breathing. "Maria," Audrey said softly. "Yes," Maria said. "This way, quickly." She led them down the corridor to room 1214, checked both directions, and pushed the door open. Audrey went through first, and then stopped so abruptly that the man behind her, Elias Vance Maria, would learn had to sidestep to avoid walking into her. Arthur was watching the door. He had managed to adjust himself slightly against the pillow. Not much the sedative Bennett had administered that morning had left his muscles unreliable, but enough to orient himself toward the entrance, enough to see his daughter walk through it. His face, which Maria had watched maintain an iron composure through 3 days of betrayal and isolation and chemical assault, did something complicated and involuntary at the sight of Audrey. His jaw worked. His eyes went bright and wet. He pressed his lips together hard and breathed through his nose. Audrey crossed the room in 4 steps and took her father's hand in both of hers, and the sound she made a single sharp intake of breath. That was really a sob that she caught at the last moment and swallowed back down, hit Maria somewhere in the middle of her chest like a physical blow. "Dad," Audrey said. Her voice was shaking badly. "I'm here. I'm right here." "I can see that," Arthur said, and his voice was still rough and barely functional, but it carried something in it now that had not been there before, something warm and unguarded, and entirely unlike the man who had snapped at his son in the boardroom 3 days ago. "Stop shaking. We don't have time for you to fall apart." "I'm not falling apart," Audrey said fiercely, even as 2 tears escaped down her face in direct contradiction of this statement. I thought you were gone. For 3 days, I thought—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Okay, I'm done. What do we need to do?" Elias Vance stepped forward, set his laptop bag on the table, and looked at Arthur with the frank, assessing gaze of a man who had spent years evaluating people under pressure. "Sir," he said simply. "You're the investigator," Arthur said. "Former federal agent," Elias said. "Currently private. Audrey tells me you have information about the individual who tampered with your vehicle. His name is Silas Black." Arthur said, his voice dropping lower, each word delivered with the precision of a man who has been storing information carefully and is now deploying it. "I don't know his full background, but Julian referred to him on a phone call as someone who does mechanical work. The night of the accident, before I left the office, I noticed a man near my vehicle in the parking structure. He was wearing a uniform, dark gray patch on the left shoulder. The name on the patch said Blackwood." He paused. "I thought he was building maintenance. I didn't think about it again until I was lying in this bed and couldn't stop thinking about anything." Elias had his phone out, typing notes. "Blackwood. That's a service contractor. They cover about 40 commercial buildings in Midtown. I can cross-reference employees against the payment Julian made." He looked up. "You said Julian made a payment." "I heard the call," Arthur said. "He told someone, an intermediary, I think, to confirm the transfer to Silas and tell him to disappear. He mentioned Montana or Mexico. The payment was described as the remaining balance, which suggests there was a prior payment." Elias nodded, typing rapidly. "I'll pull the CCTV from the parking structure. If Silas was under that car, we'll find him." "Julian also has a board meeting at 9 tomorrow morning," Arthur said. "He's planning to formalize the transfer of power, using documents he's been signing in my name over the past 3 days. Robert Harrison, my attorney, can verify whether the signatures are genuine. I need someone to contact Robert tonight." "I'll go to him personally," Audrey said. She had released her father's hand and was standing straight now, the tears gone, replaced by the focused clarity that Maria had noticed in her voice on the phone. "Robert has known Dad for 30 years. He'll come." "Don't use your regular phone to contact him," Arthur said. "Julian may have someone monitoring communications. Use a number he won't recognize." He glanced at Maria. "Could I ask—" "Yes," Maria said, immediately pulling her phone from her pocket. Use mine. Use it for whatever you need." Audrey looked at her, really looked at her with an expression that contained a gratitude too large for the confines of a hospital room. "Thank you," she said, and the words were simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. "Truly, thank you for everything." Maria felt her eyes sting again and absolutely refused to cry for the second time in one evening. She pressed her lips together and nodded and handed over the phone. Arthur looked at his daughter. In the low light of the hospital room, with the monitors beeping their steady rhythm and the city blazing indifferently beyond the window, he looked older than 62 and younger than 62 simultaneously. A man stripped of every layer of performance and pretense, reduced to something essential, and Maria thought considerably more real than anything she had seen walking through his door in the past 3 days. "Audrey," he said, "when this is over, when all of it is over, I want to talk to you. Not about the company, not about shares or succession or any of it. About us." His voice caught slightly. "About the Sunday dinners I left early, about the calls I cut short, about—" He stopped, swallowed. "About the things a father is supposed to say to his daughter and never finds the right moment for." Audrey's composure cracked again just at the edges, her chin trembling once before she pulled it back under control. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, Dad. But first we have to get you out of this bed." "First," Elias agreed, opening his laptop with quiet efficiency, "we find Silas Black." Elias Vance had not slept in 31 hours and did not particularly care. He had set up in a hotel room 3 blocks from Mercy General, booked under a name that was not his own, a habit so ingrained it required no conscious decision. His laptop sat open on the desk, 2 additional monitors connected via cables he kept in the side pocket of his bag. His phone ran 3 applications simultaneously, a facial recognition program licensed from a former bureau colleague, a financial tracking interface using codes Arthur had provided, and a mapping tool overlaid with Blackwood Building Services coverage network. Audrey sat across the room at the small table near the window, her own laptop open, a cold cup of coffee at her elbow she kept reaching for and putting back down without drinking. She had decided to be useful because the alternative feeling, the full weight of everything she was afraid of, was not an option she was willing to entertain. "Blackwood Building Services," Elias said, pulling up the contractor registration. "Founded 2011. 43 commercial properties across Midtown and Lower Manhattan." He cross-referenced the employee roster with the DMV database and ran each name through facial recognition. "Filtering for males between 25 and 35, that gives me 62 names." Julian's payment went to an account registered in Dutchess County, Audrey said without looking up. She was pulling threads through Sterling Global's internal financial records with surgical precision. $30,000 8 days before the accident, then $20,000 the morning after. She looked up. $50,000 total, 2 installments. Julian planned this at least a week in advance. "Account holder?" Elias asked. Audrey typed quickly. "Entity called Black River Auto Repair." She paused. "Black River, Silas Black." She looked at Elias with an expression containing no satisfaction, only cold confirmation. He used a variation of his own name. "First-timers always think the transaction is the hard part," Elias said flatly. "They never think about the trail." He had narrowed the facial recognition pool to 14 matches and was running each against parking structure footage from Sterling Global's security firm. "Business address for Black River. Auto repair, rural route, 4 Millbrook, New York, 90 minutes north." Audrey pulled up satellite imagery immediately. "Farm property. Main house, a barn, a small workshop." She zoomed in, studying the layout. "Perfect place to disappear after being paid $50,000 to stay quiet." "He won't stay quiet much longer," Elias said. He stopped the program. On the center monitor, a still image from the parking structure footage, appeared a man in a dark gray uniform crouching beside the rear wheel well of Arthur Sterling's sedan. The timestamp read 8:41 p.m., 22 minutes before Arthur had left the building. The patch on the man's left shoulder read clearly, Blackwood. Audrey crossed the room and leaned over his shoulder. She stared at the frozen frame, at the man with the capable hands, and the uniform, and the deliberate, unhurried posture of someone who believed he would never be found. Her hand tightened on the back of Elias's chair until her knuckles went pale. "That's him," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That's the man who almost killed my father. Elias let her have one moment. Then we need him to talk Audrey. Footage proves he was there. His testimony proves Julian paid him." "Then we go now," she said, straightening up, "before Julian sends someone to clean up that loose end." It was 3:27 in the morning. The board meeting was in 5 hours and 33 minutes. Audrey grabbed her jacket. "I'll drive." Elias raised one eyebrow. "When we find him, let me lead the conversation. You're going to want to say things that feel necessary and won't be helpful." She pulled her keys from her pocket. "I'll mostly behave," she said, and pushed open the door. The farm appeared out of the darkness at 4:53 in the morning. Audrey had driven the whole way without speaking much, both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead, with a concentration that had nothing to do with the driving and everything to do with keeping herself from thinking too hard about what she was driving toward. The highway had given way to state roads, and the state roads had given way to county routes that wound through bare winter fields and stands of leafless trees, the landscape opening up around them in the thin gray pre-dawn light like something slowly being remembered. Elias had been working the entire drive, his laptop balanced on his knees, building the financial picture of Julian's last 6 months, with the methodical thoroughness of a man constructing a case that would need to hold up under serious scrutiny. By the time Audrey turned off the county road onto the unpaved track that led to the property he had documented, 47 irregular transactions across 9 different accounts. "He's been at this for at least 18 months, Elias said, not looking up from the screen. The Cayman structure was already in place when he started moving sterling funds. This wasn't improvised. He built the infrastructure first and then started filling it. He planned it while sitting across from our father at board meetings," Audrey said. Her voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone keeping a very tight lid on something that very much wanted to come out. "While Dad was teaching him how to run the company." "Yes," Elias said simply. There was nothing useful to add to that. Audrey cut the headlights as they approached the property and let the car roll to a stop on the track 50 yards from the main house. The farm was quiet in the way that rural places are quiet at 5 in the morning, not empty but deeply still. Every living thing conserving itself against the cold. A light was on in the barn. "He's awake," Elias said. "Or he never went to sleep," Audrey said. They moved across the frozen ground in silence, frost crunching softly under their feet. The barn door was not locked. Elias pushed it open slowly, and they stepped inside into the smell of hay and machine oil, and the particular cold that collects in old wooden structures regardless of the season. Silas Black was sitting on an overturned crate near a workbench, still wearing his coat, a duffel bag packed and zipped at his feet. He was staring at nothing in particular, with the hollow, sleepless expression of a man who has been waiting for something bad to happen and has grown exhausted by the waiting. When he saw them, he lurched to his feet so fast he knocked the crate sideways, his hand going instinctively to the workbench beside him. "Don't," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a quality that stopped people. Silas stopped. In the thin barn light, Silas Black looked younger than his 30 years, and considerably more frightened. His face was unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed, his hands the large, capable hands of a man who worked with them, shaking visibly at his sides. "I don't know what you want," Silas said, his voice cracking on the last word. "I don't know who you are. I haven't done anything. The CCTV footage from the Sterling Global parking structure says otherwise," Elias said, opening his laptop and turning it to face Silas. On the screen, the frozen image from the parking structure, Silas crouching beneath Arthur Sterling's sedan, his face clear and unmistakable, the blackwood patch visible on his shoulder. 8:41 p.m., 22 minutes before Arthur Sterling's car left the building. Silas looked at the screen. The color drained from his face so completely and so quickly that Audrey actually thought for a moment he might faint. "That's not," he started. $50,000, Audrey said, stepping forward. She had promised Elias she would mostly behave, and she was mostly keeping that promise, but her voice had an edge to it now that she could not entirely smooth out. 30,000 before, 20,000 after. Black River Auto Repair, Rural Route, 4 Millbrook, New York. Your mother's address, Mr. Black. At the mention of his mother, something shifted in Silas's face. The bravado, such as it was, collapsed entirely, leaving behind something raw and afraid and very young. "She doesn't know anything," he said quickly, his voice rising. "She has nothing to do with this. She doesn't even know I'm here. She thinks I'm working a job in—" "We know she doesn't know," Audrey said, and her voice softened by a fraction. "We're not here for your mother. We're here for you." She took another step closer. "Julian Sterling will send people here eventually, Mr. Black. When he finds out someone is asking questions, and he will find out because that's how men like Julian operate, the first thing he'll do is eliminate every loose end. And right now, you are the loosest end he has." Silas's jaw was working. His eyes moved between Audrey and Elias and the image on the laptop screen and the door behind them, running calculations that he clearly already knew the answer to. "I didn't know he was going to. I thought it was just supposed to scare him," Silas said, and his voice broke entirely on the last word, cracking down the middle like green wood. "Julian told me, cut the line just enough. Not all the way, just enough to make the brakes soft so the old man would have a close call and be scared into retiring. He never said," he pressed both hands over his face, "he never said the car was going to go off the road like that. He never said the man was going to end up in a hospital." "But you took the money anyway," Elias said quietly. "After." Silas lowered his hands. His eyes were wet. "I've got debts," he said. "My mother needs—" He stopped, shook his head. "It doesn't matter. There's no excuse. I know that." Audrey looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and produced her phone, opening a file. "I need you to listen to something," she said. She pressed play. Julian's voice filled the barn, smooth and cold and unmistakable. "Cut the brake line clean enough. I want the old man permanently incapacitated, but still breathing so I can use him to sign the paperwork." Silas went absolutely still. That, Audrey said, is what Julian actually told his intermediary. Permanently incapacitated. Not a close call, not a scare. She put the phone away. "He lied to you, Mr. Black. He used you and he lied to you, and when he's finished with everything he's trying to do, you're the one who ends up in a cell while he walks away clean." The barn was very quiet. Outside, a bird called once in the gray pre-dawn and was answered by nothing. Silas reached into the inside pocket of his coat with a hand that was shaking badly and produced a phone. He unlocked it, navigated to the voice memo application, and held it out toward Audrey. On the screen, a single recording labeled simply J, 47 seconds long. "He called me himself," Silas said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I recorded it because I was scared. I didn't know what else to do." He pressed play. Julian's voice came through the small speaker, sharp and clear and absolutely damning. "Cut the brake line clean. I want the old man permanently incapacitated, but still breathing to sign the paperwork. You'll get the second payment when I confirm he's in the hospital. And Silas, if you ever breathe a word of this to anyone, I will bury you and everything you love so deep that no one will ever find the pieces." Audrey's hand closed around the phone. Her knuckles were white, and her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite rage, but occupied the territory precisely between the two. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was shaking slightly. "We'll make sure your mother is protected. You have my word on that." Silas put his face in his hands and began to cry, deep, ragged, ugly crying, the kind that comes from a place of genuine shame rather than self-pity, the kind that a person cannot perform because it costs too much. Audrey looked at Elias over the top of Silas's bowed head. Elias looked back at her, and for the first time since this had begun, allowed himself a single slow nod that meant we have what we need. Robert Harrison arrived at Mercy General at 8:15 in the morning, carrying a paper cup of coffee he had not touched, and wearing the expression of a man who had not slept. He was 62 years old, the same age as Arthur, and they had met at Columbia Law School in 1984 over a shared textbook and a mutual contempt for a professor who confused volume with intelligence. In the 40 years since Robert had argued cases before the Supreme Court, built one of the most respected corporate law practices in the country, and turned down 3 federal appointments, because he did not trust the government to leave him alone long enough to do good work. He was in Arthur's considered opinion the most rigidly principled man he had ever known, which was precisely why Arthur had never asked him to do anything that required otherwise. The nurse at the 12th floor station recognized him from his previous visits and waved him through with the particular deference that expensive suits and confident posture tend to produce in institutional settings. Robert nodded, his thanks, walked down the corridor to room 1214 and pushed open the door. He stopped. Arthur Sterling was looking directly at him, not the unfocused vacancy that Bennett's reports described, not the half-closed eyes of deep unconsciousness. Arthur was lying against his pillow with his eyes open and fully alert, watching the door with an expression that Robert recognized immediately, because he had seen it across negotiating tables and courtrooms for 4 decades. The expression of a man who has been waiting, who has been patient, past the point where patience becomes something closer to ferocity, and who is now ready to move. Robert Harrison, who had stood unmoved through Supreme Court arguments and hostile depositions, and one occasion in 1997, when a opposing counsel had thrown a water glass at him, felt his legs go genuinely unsteady. "Arthur," he said. The word came out wrong, too small, too thin, stripped of the composure he had spent a lifetime constructing. "Close the door," Arthur said. His voice was wrecked, but his eyes were not. "Lock it." Robert closed the door. He did not lock it, hospital room. Doors did not lock from the inside, but he pressed his back against it in a way that served the same purpose. He stood there for a moment, breathing, looking at his oldest friend alive and conscious in a bed, where he had been told repeatedly, and with medical authority, that his oldest friend was dying. "How long?" Robert managed. "3rd day," Arthur said. "I've been conscious since the 3rd day." Robert pressed his lips together very hard. His jaw was working. He set the untouched coffee down on the table beside the door because his hand had begun to shake slightly, and he did not want to spill it. "Bennett told the board—" "Bennett is on Julian's payroll," Arthur said. "He's been administering sedatives to keep me under and filing false reports with the board. Julian has been using the incapacity clause to sign transfer documents in my name. The signatures are forgeries. He's using scanned versions of my signature from old documents." His voice was steady and methodical, the voice of a man delivering a briefing, but his eyes were doing something different from his voice, something that Robert had not seen in them in a very long time. "I need you to verify the signatures, Robert. All of them. Every document Julian has filed since the accident." Robert crossed the room and pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down heavily the way a man sits when his legs have decided they have had enough of pretending everything is fine. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at Arthur very carefully. "Tell me everything," he said. Arthur told him. He was concise and precise and thorough, the way he had always been in situations that required it, moving through the sequence of events with the disciplined economy of a man who understands that time is the resource he can least afford to waste. Robert listened without interrupting, which was his greatest professional skill, and the one that had served him best over 4 decades, the ability to receive information completely before he began to process it. When Arthur finished, Robert sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The signatures, he said finally. If Julian used scanned copies, the forgeries would be technically sophisticated, but they'd have a specific flaw. Scanned signatures reproduce at a fixed pressure ratio. The ink distribution is uniform in a way that human signatures never are. No two genuine signatures from the same person are identical. They vary in pressure speed angle. He looked at Arthur. If I can get those documents in front of a forensic handwriting examiner within the next 3 hours, I can have a certified opinion before the board meeting starts. Can you get them? Arthur asked. Julian filed them through the corporate secretary's office. Robert said, I have standing access to all Sterling legal documents as senior counsel of record. Julian can't revoke that without a board vote, which he hasn't taken yet because he's been moving too fast to cover every procedural base. He pulled out his own phone. I'm going to call Margaret at the Forensic Document Lab on Lexington. She owes me a significant favor, and she works fast. He was already dialing when something else crossed Arthur's face, a different kind of weight, older and more complicated than anything they had discussed so far. There's one more thing, Arthur said. Robert lowered the phone slightly. Tell me. In my office. The private safe behind the Hopper painting. You know the combination. 1984, Robert said. The year we met. There's a manila envelope in the back, Arthur said. It's been there for 30 years. I need you to get it and bring it to me before tonight. He paused. Don't open it. Just bring it. Robert looked at him for a long moment with the particular attention of a lawyer who has learned to read what people are not saying as carefully as what they are. Arthur, he said slowly, what's in that envelope? Arthur held his gaze. Something I should have dealt with 30 years ago, he said. Something that changes everything about what Julian thinks he's entitled to. His jaw tightened. I was protecting someone who didn't deserve the protection, and it cost me 30 years of being manipulated by a man who isn't even who he thinks he is. The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside in the corridor, the hospital moved through its morning routines, the rattle of a medication cart, the distant sound of a television footsteps passing and fading. Robert Harrison had known Arthur Sterling for 40 years. He had watched him build an empire and survive a marriage, and lose people he loved, and make decisions that Robert had sometimes disagreed with, and sometimes admired, and occasionally found genuinely alarming. In all of that time, he had never heard him speak in quite this way, with this particular combination of exhaustion and resolve, the voice of a man who has finished carrying something alone, and is ready finally to put it down in front of someone else. I'll get the envelope, Robert said. He stood straight in his jacket and picked up the untouched coffee. And Arthur. He paused with his hand on the door. For the record, I knew Bennett's reports were wrong. I've known for 2 days. I just couldn't prove it. His voice dropped to something quieter and rougher than his usual register. I'm glad you're still here, you stubborn old man. Arthur looked at him. Something moved across his face that in another man might have been called gratitude, but in Arthur Sterling expressed itself as a single slow nod and the faint, barely perceptible relaxation of a jaw that had been set hard for 3 days. Go get my documents, Robert, he said, and hurry. Robert Harrison walked out the door and down the corridor with the long, purposeful stride of a man who has decided what kind of lawyer he is going to be today and finds the decision clarifying. The forensic document examiner took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Margaret was 60 years old, precise as a surgical instrument, and entirely unimpressed by urgency, a quality that Robert had always found simultaneously maddening and reassuring, because it meant that her conclusions, when they came, were the product of rigor rather than pressure. She worked in a lab on Lexington Avenue that smelled of chemicals and old paper, and she had examined documents for Robert on 4 previous occasions, each time producing findings that held up under the most aggressive cross-examination opposing counsel could manage. She called Robert at 11:17 with the results. All 12 documents, she said without preamble. The signatures are generated from a single source scan. The pressure distribution is uniform across all copies to within 0.3%, which is physically impossible for genuine handwritten signatures. The ink depth is consistent with digital reproduction rather than ballpoint contact. A brief pause. In 32 years of forensic document examination, Robert I have never seen forgeries this technically sophisticated. Whoever did this had access to very high-quality scanning equipment and significant expertise in digital reproduction. Another pause. They were also ultimately not quite good enough. Robert was sitting in Audrey's hotel room when the call came through his jacket, off his sleeves, rolled to the elbows surrounded by printed financial records that Audrey and Elias had assembled during the drive back from Millbrook. Audrey was across the room, cross-legged on the bed with her own laptop, and she looked up the moment she saw Robert's expression change. "Margaret will certify her findings in an affidavit," Robert said, lowering the phone. "Every document Julian filed is a forgery. Every single one." Audrey closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and said, "How many documents total?" 12, Robert said, covering transfers and authorizations across 7 sterling subsidiaries. He picked up the top sheet from the stack beside him, which brings us to this. Audrey had spent the drive back from Millbrook on the phone with Elias, who had continued building the financial picture while she drove, and the picture that had emerged was considerably larger and considerably darker than any of them had anticipated. "Walk me through it," Robert said. Audrey turned her laptop to face him. On the screen, a network diagrammed 12 nodes, connected by lines of varying thickness, each node labeled with a corporate name. "Elias mapped Julian's financial structure," she said. "He's been building it for at least 18 months. These 12 entities," she indicated the nodes, "are all registered in the Cayman Islands. They exist only on paper. No employees, no physical addresses, no actual business operations. They exist for one purpose, which is to receive money from Sterling Global subsidiaries and make it disappear." Robert studied the diagram. "How much?" "Across 18 months, approximately $200 million, Audrey said. Her voice was steady, but her hands, Robert noticed, were pressed flat against her knees, in the way people press their hands flat when they need something to hold on to. He moved it in increments, never more than 8 million in a single transaction, always categorized under legitimate-sounding line items. Technology infrastructure investment, strategic consulting fees, market expansion reserves. She looked up. Our CFO flagged 2 of the transactions as unusual 6 months ago. Julian overruled the flag personally and had the CFO reassigned to the Singapore office. Robert exhaled through his nose. 200 million? That's Sterling's money, Audrey said, and for the first time since the night before the careful composure she had maintained began to show its seams. Her voice tightened. That's Dad's money. That's 30 years of his work. That's the Singapore expansion and the infrastructure fund and the employee pension contributions that were supposed to... She stopped, pressed her lips together. Sorry. Don't apologize, Robert said firmly. Audrey took a breath. There's more, she said. Beyond the 200 million from Sterling, Julian has personal debts of approximately $50 million. The creditors are not banks. She turned the laptop back toward herself and pulled up a secondary file. 3 of them are entities that Elias's contacts in the Federal Financial Crimes Unit have flagged in connection with organized crime investigations. These are not people who send lawyers when they want their money back. Robert was quiet for a moment, processing. So Julian needs the full Sterling asset base, not just a portion of it, to clear his debts and have anything left over, he said. That's why he moved so fast. That's why the accident happened when it did. He was out of time. He's been out of time for months, Audrey said. He just kept pushing the deadline forward until he couldn't push it anymore. She closed the laptop. The people he owes money to, they gave him a deadline. I think the deadline is very soon. I think that's why the board meeting is today. Robert stood up and began rolling down his sleeves with the methodical precision of a man preparing for something. I need to make 3 calls, he said. The first is to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The second is to the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. The third is to the Sterling Global Board Secretary, to formally notify her that the documents filed under Arthur's incapacity are fraudulent, and that a legal challenge is being initiated. He buttoned his cuff. After those calls are made, Julian Sterling will not be able to complete a single additional transaction using Sterling assets. The accounts will be frozen pending investigation. He'll know something is wrong, Audrey said. He'll realize, yes, Robert said. He'll realize, and when he does, he'll accelerate. He'll try to push through the final transfer tonight at the board meeting in front of witnesses, using the forged documents before anyone can formally challenge them. He picked up his jacket. Which means we need your father in that room. Audrey looked at him. He can barely move. I know, Robert said, but Julian does not know that. And the moment Arthur walks through those doors, he paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who has spent 40 years understanding the precise weight of language. Everything Julian has built in the past 6 days comes apart, not gradually, all at once. Audrey stood up and reached for her own jacket. Then we need to get him ready, she said. There's one more thing, Robert said. He reached into his jacket and produced a manila envelope, old, slightly yellowed at the corners, sealed with tape that had dried and begun to peel at the edges. He held it out toward Audrey. Your father asked me to retrieve this from his office safe. He said it changes everything about what Julian thinks he's entitled to. He paused. He said not to open it. I haven't. Audrey looked at the envelope in Robert's hand. Something in its age and its weight, and the careful way Robert was holding it, made her chest tighten with a premonition she could not name. Let's take it to him, she said. They found Arthur awake and sitting up, not fully upright. The residual effects of Bennett's sedative had left his muscles unreliable in ways that changed from hour to hour, some moments better than others, none of them yet trustworthy. But Maria had spent the past 2 hours working with him, moving his arms and legs through slow, deliberate exercises, talking quietly while she did it, and the result was a man who was propped against 3 pillows, with his eyes open and his jaw set, and the unmistakable expression of someone who has decided that the limitations of his body are a negotiating position rather than a final answer. He watched the door when Robert and Audrey came in. His eyes moved immediately to the envelope in Robert's hands, and stayed there with the fixed attention of a man who has been waiting for something for a very long time, and is not entirely sure he is ready for it to arrive. Close the door, he said. Hey, Audrey closed it. She crossed the room and pulled a chair close to the bed, close enough that she could have reached his hand without extending her arm fully, and the proximity itself communicated something that neither of them put into words, but both of them felt. Robert remained standing near the foot of the bed, the envelope held in both hands, with the careful neutrality of a man who understands he is carrying something significant without knowing precisely how significant. Give it to me, Arthur said. Robert placed the envelope in Arthur's hands. It was old. The paper had yellowed slightly at the corners, and the tape sealing the flap had dried and begun to curl away from the surface, in the way that adhesive does after decades of climate change and neglect. Arthur held it without opening it, his fingers moving slowly across the surface, feeling the brittleness of it, the slight rigidity of the document folded inside the weight of 30 years of silence compressed into an object he could hold in one hand. His jaw worked, his throat moved. He pressed his lips together and breathed through his nose and did not speak for a long moment. Dad, Audrey said softly, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he said. I've been carrying this since Julian was 2 years old. I have told myself every year that the right moment would present itself, and every year I found a reason why the moment had not yet arrived. He exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed to carry something with it on the way out. The truth is that I was afraid, not of what it would do to Julian, of what it would do to me. He broke the seal. The document inside was a single-page formal laboratory, letterhead, precise technical language. the kind of clinical clarity that leaves no room for interpretation or hope. Arthur unfolded it with hands that were not entirely steady and looked at it for a moment, with the expression of a man reading something he has already memorized, something that has lived in his mind for so long it has become part of the architecture of how he understands himself. He held it out to Audrey without a word. She took it. Her eyes moved across the page quickly. She had always read fast, faster than anyone he had ever known, absorbing information with a completeness that had made her exceptional in every academic setting she had ever occupied, and which he had failed repeatedly and inexcusably to adequately acknowledge. Her eyes stopped. She looked up. "Julian is not your biological son," she said. The words came out very quietly, not a question, not an accusation, simply the sound of a person saying something true out loud for the first time, and feeling the weight of it settle into the room. "No," Arthur said, "he is not." Audrey pressed one hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled immediately, the tears arriving before she had given them permission, hot and sudden, and entirely beyond her control. "Mom," she said the word barely audible behind her hand, small and broken, and full of things that a single syllable should not have been able to contain. "Your mother was not a bad person," Arthur said, and his voice was firm on this with a firmness that had clearly been maintained through long practice, repeated to himself so many times that it had become a kind of mantra. "She was lonely, and I was absent, and she made a choice that she spent every remaining year of her life trying to make right in every way available to her." He paused. "I found out when Julian was 2 years old. I had already been his father for 2 years by then. I had held him when he had fevers. I had sat on the floor and built block towers with him, and knocked them down and built them again." His voice dropped slightly. "I decided it did not matter. I decided that love was a choice, and that I was choosing it regardless of what a laboratory document said." "But it did matter," Audrey said. Her hand had come down from her mouth. She was holding the document carefully, the way you hold something fragile. "It mattered because he used it. He built his entire claim on being your son and heir, and he built his claim on something that was never real," Arthur said, "and I let him, because I was too proud to admit that I had made a mistake in keeping the secret, and too stubborn to face what facing it would cost." His voice tightened. "I kept thinking he would become someone worth protecting. I kept waiting for the son I had chosen to show up inside the man he was becoming." His jaw tightened hard. "He never did." Audrey put the document down on the bed, very slowly, very carefully, as though it were something that might shatter. Then she did something that she had not done since she was 12 years old, and her mother had died, and Arthur had stood in the hospital corridor, too frozen with grief to move toward her. She leaned forward and put her arms around her father and held on. She cried against his shoulder the way people cry when they have been holding something for a very long time, not delicately, not quietly, but with the full shaking weight of it, her shoulders moving, her breath coming in ragged, uneven pulls. 30 years of distance and longing and carefully managed disappointment releasing all at once into the charcoal wool of his hospital blanket. Arthur's arms came up around her. He held her the way he should have held her 30 years ago and 20 years ago and 10 years ago on all the occasions when she had needed it, and he had been somewhere else, physically or emotionally, or both, and had not been there to give it. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was wrecked. "I'm sorry for every dinner I left early, and every call I cut short, and every time you needed me to show up, and I chose something else instead." His arms tightened. "You deserve better than what I gave you. You deserved a father who understood what he had." Audrey pulled back enough to look at him. Her face was wet, and her eyes were red, and she looked in that moment, very young and very strong simultaneously, the two things coexisting in her the way they had always coexisted in her, if only he had been paying close enough attention to see it. "You're here now," she said. Her voice was rough but steady. "That's what matters. You're here now." Arthur looked at his daughter, really looked the way he had not looked in years, taking in the person she had become without his help, and in spite of his absence, and felt something move through him that he did not have a precise name for. It was not quite pride, though it contained pride. It was not quite love, though it was made entirely of love. It was something older and more fundamental than either the recognition of a person who is genuinely good, genuinely worthy, genuinely deserving of everything the world has to offer, and the devastating clarity of understanding that you had almost missed seeing it entirely. "Robert," Arthur said, without looking away from Audrey, "the envelope, keep it safe. Tonight, in front of everyone, Julian has assembled to witness his triumph. His voice hardened to something absolute and final. I want them to see exactly who he is, and exactly who he is not." Robert folded the document back into the envelope with great care and placed it inside his jacket. "I'll have it ready," he said. Maria had been standing at the window throughout her back to the room, giving them what privacy she could in a space that did not offer much. Now she turned and looked at Arthur and Audrey. Together, the old man and his daughter holding on to each other in the pale afternoon light of a hospital room, and her eyes were bright, and her expression carried the particular quality of someone who has seen a great deal of hardship and has learned to recognize when it appears the exact moment when something begins to heal. Arthur looked at her over Audrey's shoulder. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you, Maria, for all of it." Maria pressed her lips together and nodded once, and did not trust herself to say anything more. "I need to get out of this bed," Arthur said, "and I need a suit." The suit arrived at 3 in the afternoon. Audrey had sent Elias to Arthur's penthouse on the Upper West Side, with a spare key from Robert's office safe, and Elias had returned 90 minutes later, carrying a garment bag over one arm, and the carefully neutral expression of a man who has retrieved evidence from crime scenes and river bottoms, and once from the bathroom of a sitting congressman, and who is nonetheless finding something unexpectedly affecting about being asked to collect an old man's clothes. He had chosen correctly. Arthur knew it the moment Audrey unzipped the bag, a charcoal wool blend, double-breasted, the cut slightly formal by contemporary standards, in a way that had always been a deliberate choice, rather than an oversight. He had worn it the day he signed the incorporation papers that turned Sterling Global from a 2-man operation in a rented Midtown office into a publicly traded company. He had worn it because he believed, and had always believed, that what you put on your body communicates something about what you believe the moment deserves. "That one," he said. Audrey looked at the suit, and then at her father, with an expression that was tender and complicated, and entirely unguarded. "Of course, that one," she said softly, and her voice carried something in it that told him she understood exactly why without needing it explained. Maria had been working with Arthur since noon. She had begun with his hands, slow, patient movements, bending and extending each finger in sequence, working up through the wrists and forearms, with the methodical thoroughness of someone who has learned to care for bodies in decline through direct experience rather than formal instruction. She talked while she worked, not about anything in particular, just the steady, quiet stream of a voice keeping company, because she had found that bodies respond better when the mind is occupied with something other than the effort of what the body is being asked to do. My grandmother used to say, Maria said, rotating Arthur's left wrist in a slow, careful circle, that the body never truly forgets anything. It stores everything. Joy, grief, fear, kindness, all of it lives in the muscles somewhere. You just have to remind it what it already knows. Your grandmother sounds like a woman worth knowing, Arthur said, concentrating on the movement. She was the most stubborn person I have ever encountered in my life, Maria said with a warmth that made the word stubborn sound like the highest possible compliment. 2 different doctors told her she had 6 months. She outlived them both. A brief pause. She said she had too many things left to be annoyed about to find time to die. Arthur made a sound that surprised him, brief and slightly rough, and entirely genuine, recognizable after 6 days of silence and sedatives and the mechanical breathing of a ventilator, as something he had nearly forgotten how to produce. A laugh, a real one. Maria smiled without looking up from her work, the small private smile of someone whose effort has just paid off in exactly the way she hoped it would. By 1:30, Arthur could sit upright without the support of the pillows. By 2, he could move both arms through their full range of motion with reasonable control. By 2:45, with Maria on his left side and Elias, who had returned with the suit and stayed because nobody had told him to leave, and he had decided his presence was operationally useful. On his right, Arthur took his first steps across the hospital room floor. They were slow. They were effortful. They were the steps of a man rebuilding something from its foundations, with complete awareness of how much the rebuilding costs, and absolute refusal to be deterred by that knowledge. Again, Arthur said when they reached the window. You need to rest, Elias said. You have 4 hours before the board meeting, and you need... Again, Arthur said in a tone that communicated with perfect clarity that this was not a point he was willing to negotiate. Elias looked at Maria. Maria looked at Elias. The look between them contained an entire conversation, the kind that develops between people who have been through enough together to have built a shared language, without needing to agree on its vocabulary. They turned and walked Arthur back across the room. 3 more times, each crossing slightly steadier than the last. Each one a small argument won against the body's reluctance. Leo arrived at 4:15. He came in the way he always came in, with the slightly guilty energy of someone who is technically not supposed to be somewhere, and has concluded that the reason for being there is more important than the prohibition against it. He was wearing his school backpack and carrying something flat against his chest, held with both arms in the careful way of someone transporting something fragile. He stopped just inside the door and looked at Arthur with the frank, assessing gaze that Arthur had come to recognize as Leo's version of taking the full measure of a situation before committing to a response. You look better, Leo announced. Your eyes are more awake. I feel better, Arthur said. Come in. Leo approached the bed with the gravity of someone conducting important business, and held out what he had been carrying. It was a sheet of drawing paper, larger than notebook size, covered in colored pencil, with the particular density of a child who has put genuine, sustained effort into something. 3 figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun, one tall in a dark suit, silver at the temples, one smaller female standing straight beside him with her chin up, and between them a woman in a gray uniform with dark hair, her hands joined with theirs on both sides. Below the figures in Leo's careful block, capitals my family, and also captain. A small bear occupied the lower right corner, slightly lopsided but unmistakably intentional. Arthur held the drawing and looked at it for a long time. He looked at the careful detail of it, the way the suited figure's silver hair caught the drawn sun, the way the woman in the middle was smiling with her whole face, rather than just her mouth, the way the 3 pairs of joined hands were rendered with a precision that exceeded what a 7-year-old hand should technically have been capable of and had achieved anyway, through the particular alchemy of genuine feeling translated into work. His chest rose and fell slowly, his throat tightened, his eyes went bright and stayed bright, and he did not look away from the drawing or attempt to compose himself into something more controlled. Leo, Arthur said. His voice was unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the sedative and nothing to do with physical weakness. This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me. Leo considered this with genuine seriousness. Better than the Forbes cover? He asked. Considerably better than the Forbes cover, Arthur said. Leo nodded, satisfied in the complete, uncomplicated way of someone whose assessment has been confirmed. I thought so, he said. Magazines are just paper. This one has feelings inside it. Maria turned to the window. Her shoulders rose once and fell. Arthur noticed and said nothing, and felt in the noticing and the saying. nothing that he was learning something important about what it means to be present for another person without making their moment about yourself. Will you stay? Arthur asked Leo, until it's time. Leo looked at his mother. Maria turned from the window, her eyes bright but steady, and nodded. Okay, Leo said, and dragged the chair close to the bed with the decisive efficiency of someone who has made a decision and does not revisit decisions once made. I'll tell you about my next drawing. It's going to have a dragon in it, a friendly one. He protects people instead of scaring them. Tell me about him, Arthur said. Leo talked. His voice filled the room with the particular quality of light that only completely unself-conscious people carry, warm and directionless, illuminating without intending, to the way sunlight comes through a window without choosing where to fall. Arthur listened with his full attention, the drawing held against his chest, and somewhere in the middle of Leo's detailed description of the friendly dragon's color scheme and preferred diet, his eyes closed, not from the sedative, not from Bennett's chemistry or the weight of 6 days of survival, from the simple animal peace of a man who is for the first time in longer than he can honestly account for not alone. Maria sat in the other chair with her hands folded in her lap. Leo talked, on his voice dropping gradually, as he noticed Arthur's breathing slow and deepening, adjusting without being asked to something quieter. A child's instinctive accommodation of someone who has finally been given permission to rest. When Audrey came to the door at 6:30, she stopped in the frame and stood very still for a moment. Her father was asleep with a child's drawing held against his chest, a small boy sitting nearby with his sketchbook open drawing quietly. A woman in a gray uniform keeps watch over both of them with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who does not require acknowledgement to keep showing up. Audrey pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, blinked hard, breathed. Then she stepped into the room and said softly, "Dad, it's time." The grand ballroom of Sterling Tower occupied the entire 48th floor and had, in Arthur's considered opinion, always been slightly too magnificent for its own good. He had designed it himself 22 years ago when the building was still under construction, and the architects had presented him with what they called a multi-purpose event space, and he had called it a missed opportunity. He had wanted something that communicated the permanence of the institution ceilings high enough to make people feel appropriately small windows on 3 sides, that turned the Manhattan skyline into wallpaper materials that would still be standing when everyone currently alive had been replaced by people who had never heard of any of them. He had succeeded perhaps more completely than was wise. The room had a tendency to make people feel that whatever was happening inside it was by virtue of the setting alone historically significant. Tonight Julian had filled it with 230 people and the intention of proving him right. The guest list was a precision instrument. Every major Sterling shareholder, 12 members of the financial press, 6 board members, 4 international partners, whose collective business relationship with Sterling was worth more than the GDP of a small nation, and a carefully curated selection of civic figures whose presence would lend the proceedings the patina of institutional legitimacy that Julian understood correctly to be almost as valuable as actual legitimacy. The catering was exceptional. The lighting had been calibrated by a specialist. A string quartet played in the far corner, with the practiced self-effacement of musicians who understand that their function is to be heard without being listened to. Julian moved through the room with the fluid confidence of a man who has been rehearsing this moment for a very long time and is finally standing inside it. He shook hands with shareholders whose names he had memorized, along with the precise value of their holdings. He spoke to the international partners in the careful language of people who have learned to communicate across cultures without accidentally meaning anything. He accepted condolences about his father from people whose condolences contained beneath their surface warmth the very specific question of what his father's condition meant for their investments. And he answered that question with a combination of gravity and reassurance that he had practiced in front of a mirror until it looked entirely unrehearsed. He was, Arthur thought, from the service corridor, where he stood watching through a narrow gap in the door, a genuinely accomplished performer, which was the most damning thing Arthur had ever thought about anyone. Audrey stood beside him close enough that he could feel the tension in her without touching her, the particular tension of someone who has been waiting for a long time and is now watching the last few minutes of the wait run out. She was watching Julian work the room with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite grief, but occupied the territory precisely between the two. "He learned it from watching you," she said quietly. "The room management, the handshakes, the way he makes each person feel like the most important person there." "I know," Arthur said. "I taught him. I thought I was teaching him to lead." He paused. "I was teaching him to perform." Robert stood on Arthur's other side leather folder under his arm, checking his watch, with the contained impatience of a man who has set a series of events in motion and is monitoring their convergence. The SEC notification had been filed at 6:45. The United States Attorney's Office had confirmed receipt at 6:52. Margaret affidavit was in the folder. By early evening, a federal court had issued an emergency restraining order at the request of the United States Attorney's Office, freezing Sterling's primary subsidiary accounts pending investigation. Robert had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing the filing calling in a favor with a judge he had known for 20 years. It had cost him something. He did not regret it. It was 7:11. Inside the ballroom, Julian had taken the stage. The room settled with the practiced ease of an audience that has been assembled for a purpose and understands its role. Julian stood at the podium in his new charcoal suit. 3 weeks old, Arthur had noted with a cold private irony that placed the order 1 week before the accident and looked out at 230 faces with an expression of grave, composed authority that he had, Arthur knew, been building toward for 32 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said, and his voice carried the room without effort, warm and measured and weighted with the performance of a grief he did not feel. "Thank you for being here on what is for our family an extraordinarily difficult evening." He paused, allowing the pause to work. "My father, Arthur Sterling, built this company from nothing. Over 30 years, through markets that collapsed and partnerships that failed and challenges that would have ended lesser enterprises, he turned a vision into an institution. He looked down briefly, a gesture calibrated to read as private emotion controlled at personal cost. Nearly a week ago, the medical team confirmed what we had all feared. My father will not recover. He will not return to this building or this work." A murmur moved through the assembled crowd. The financial press were writing. The shareholders were watching Julian with the careful calculation of people who have money on the table and need to determine quickly which way the wind is blowing. In accordance with the succession documents my father executed prior to his incapacitation, Julian continued gesturing toward the screen behind him, where a scanned document appeared in enlarged form. "I am tonight formally assuming the position of chairman and chief executive officer of Sterling Global." His voice shifted into something that managed to sound simultaneously reluctant and inevitable, the voice of a man accepting a burden rather than claiming a prize. "I intend to honor everything my father built. I intend to take Sterling forward with the same vision and the same commitment to excellence that defined his tenure." The applause started near the front, led Arthur observed by the same board members who had stood over his hospital bed 3 days ago discussing his voting shares, and spread through the room with the momentum of people who have decided that the appropriate response to concentrated power is to signal their alignment with it as rapidly as possible. Julian raised one hand to quiet it. The gesture was unhurried and precise, and it worked immediately, which was the most honest assessment of where the room stood. "There is one additional matter," he said. His voice shifted again, reluctant, now brotherly, the voice of a man doing something difficult out of duty rather than desire. "My sister Audrey has been a beloved member of this family, and a valued presence in the company's public life. In recognition of her position and in accordance with our father's expressed wishes, Audrey will receive a substantial trust allocation, ensuring her financial security for life. He looked toward the section of the room where Audrey would have been seated if she had been seated. She will not hold an operational role in the company going forward. This reflects not any limitation of her abilities, but our father's firm belief that the company requires a singular executive voice during this period of transition. How generous, Audrey said in the corridor through her teeth, with a precision and control that Arthur found under the circumstances genuinely impressive. Julian accepted the formal transfer document from the corporate secretary, a woman who had been processing his forged signatures for 3 days, and who would Arthur knew be cooperating fully with the subsequent federal investigation in exchange for consideration she did not yet know she had earned. The document was placed on the podium. The corporate notary stepped forward. The pen was produced. Julian uncapped it. 7:15, Robert said, checking his watch. Julian lowered the pen toward the document. Are you really going to protect your sister? Arthur said, his voice carrying across the ballroom, without amplification, without effort. The voice of a man who had commanded rooms for 62 years and had not lost the ability to fill one, by taking everything that belongs to her Julian. The pen stopped. 230 people stopped with it. The string quartet caught mid-phrase, simply ceased playing, and sat very still with their instruments in their hands, as though movement of any kind might be the wrong response to what had just happened. Julian's head came up slowly. His face, in the fraction of a second before he was able to control it, showed something that Arthur had never seen there in 32 years of watching him. Not guilt, not shame. Something more primitive and more honest than either of those things. The expression of a man whose story, the story he has been telling himself, the story that makes the unbearable choices bearable, has just been interrupted by someone who knows how it actually ends. At the far end of the grand ballroom of Sterling Tower, the door opened, and Arthur Sterling walked in. Arthur crossed the threshold, and the room held its breath. He did not pause. He did not look at the guests or the press or the board members whose names he had watched appear on falsified documents for 6 days. He looked at Julian. Are you going to sign that Julian? Arthur's voice carried across the ballroom without effort, without amplification. 62 years of commanding rooms had given him that. In front of all these people. The silence was total. Robert Harrison stepped forward from the left side of the room, adjusting his glasses and holding the bound document. His voice was measured and absolute. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Robert Harrison. I am senior counsel to Arthur Sterling and to Sterling Global. I am here to formally notify this board and all witnesses present that every document signed in Mr. Sterling's name during his hospitalization is legally void. He paused. Forensic analysis by Dr. Margaret of the Lexington Forensic Document Laboratory confirms that 12 signatures were digitally reproduced. Ink pressure uniform to within 0.3%. They are forgeries, every one of them. A murmur broke across the room like a wave. Audrey stepped forward next, sharp and composed in a midnight blue dress, a tablet in her hand. She turned the screen toward the room, and the projection behind the podium changed Julian's succession slide, replaced by a financial map, clean and damning. 12 company names, 12 Cayman Islands registrations, transfer totals climbing to $200 million accumulated over 18 months through accounts disguised as infrastructure reserves and consulting fees. The accounts, Audrey said clearly, were frozen at 7:15 this evening by SEC order. Julian's pen dropped from his hand and struck the lectern with a small sharp sound that seemed enormous in the silence. Then the recording played. 47 seconds. Julian's voice, unmistakable, clear as a winter morning, instructing Silas Black to ensure Arthur Sterling's incapacitation was permanent. The room went rigid. A board member from Singapore pushed back his chair. Two journalists typed furiously. A second recording followed Silas Black's voice, flat and unsteady, delivering a sworn statement that his attorney had witnessed 40 minutes earlier in a federal field office downtown. He had cut the brake line. He had been paid $50,000 to do it. He had the wire transfers to prove it. He was sorry. Arthur reached into his breast pocket and produced the final envelope, the DNA report, 30 years old, sealed until tonight. He did not explain it at length. Julian is not my biological son, and because he was never legally adopted, only informally acknowledged his claim to succession under the Sterling Family Trust, which specifies biological descendancy as a condition of inheritance, is void. My attorneys filed the challenge 40 minutes ago. He removed the signet ring from his right hand. He crossed to Audrey and placed it in her open palm. The company, he said quietly, belongs to you. Audrey closed her fingers around the ring. Her eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. Not here, not in front of 230 people who had just watched her brother's empire dissolve in real time. She would cry later. Tonight she stood straight. The federal agents moved in. The handcuffs clicked. Julian Sterling was led from the room he had tried to inherit, through the same ballroom his father had built, past the guests he had invited to witness his triumph. He did not look back. The handcuffs clicked into place at 10:43 in the evening. Dr. Thomas Bennett had not moved from his office chair when the agents arrived. He had known about the board meeting. He had watched the alerts come through on his phone, first the SEC notice, then the federal filing, then a text from Julian's number that simply read, "Gone dark," and was never followed by another. He had considered leaving. He had packed a bag and set it by the door, and then sat back down and not touched it again. Some part of him, the part that had once taken a Hippocratic oath in a room full of people who believed he meant it, had decided that it was finished. He had simply sat there, stethoscope still, around his neck, medical degree still hanging on the wall behind him, and waited as if some part of him had known, since the moment Julian Sterling had called him 3 weeks ago, that this night was always coming. "Dr. Bennett," the agent said, "you are under arrest." Bennett nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has run out of arguments with himself. He did not resist. He did not speak. He straightened his coat with the quiet habit of 45 years of professional dignity and walked out of his office for the last time. Upstairs, the ballroom was still and strange in the aftermath of everything. The catering staff moved carefully between tables, stacking plates with a deliberate quietness, as if noise might disturb something fragile that still hung in the air. A few guests remained speaking in low voices. The projection screen at the front of the room had gone dark. The string quartet's chairs sat empty music stands, abandoned mid-arrangement. Audrey stood near the window, looking out at the city. Her brother was gone. Her father was alive. The ring was in her hand. She was not sure yet what to feel, so she felt all of it at once. Grief and relief and fury, and a love for her father so complicated and so long suppressed that it rose in her chest like something physical. Arthur appeared beside her. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "I failed you," he said. "For a long time. I know that." Audrey turned to look at him. Her jaw was tight. "Yes," she said honestly. "You did." "I know." He did not look away. "I intend to spend whatever time I have left making that mean something different." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his shoulder, and Arthur wrapped both arms around his daughter and held on. The morning came quietly. The hospital garden was cool and pale at 8:15, the kind of Thursday morning that feels newly washed. Arthur sat in his wheelchair beside an oak bench, his suit jacket over his shoulders, watching a sparrow investigate the flower beds with tremendous professional seriousness. Maria arrived at 8:22 with warm tea. Leo arrived behind her at a run yellow jacket, flying a rolled drawing under his arm. He stopped in front of Arthur's wheelchair and held up the paper with both hands. It was a crayon drawing a tall building with a star stick, figures. Holding hands, a small bear in the corner. In the center, a man in a dark suit sitting in a chair. Beside him, a woman in gray and a small boy in yellow. At the bottom, in large, careful letters, "You are not alone anymore." Arthur looked at the drawing for a long time. His chin trembled, then his shoulders. Then something vast and old and sealed inside him gave way completely, and he pressed one hand over his eyes and wept deeply without performance, without apology. Leo stepped forward and placed his small hand over Arthur's. "It's okay," Leo said firmly. "Mama says crying means your heart still works." Arthur laughed through his tears, broken and real and completely unguarded. He wiped his face and looked at Maria, who was smiling. The quiet smile of a woman who has always known exactly what matters. "Hot chocolate?" Leo asked. Arthur took the boy's hand. "Yes," he said. "Hot chocolate sounds exactly right." The city hummed beyond the garden walls, but in that small, quiet space something had been restored that no court order could grant and no wire transfer could purchase. Arthur Sterling had come back, not to his empire, not to his title, to himself. I spent 62 years building an empire, and it took 6 days flat on my back, unable to move a single finger, to understand what I had actually been building toward. I am Arthur Sterling, and this is what I know now that I did not know before. Do not be like me. Do not wait until you are lying in a hospital bed, listening to your own son dismantle everything you built before you look at the people beside you and truly see them. I had a daughter who deserved a father. I had 30 years of Sunday dinners I left early and phone calls I cut short. Do not make the same trade I made. Do not choose the balance sheet over the people sitting at your table. I believe God does not send angels in the way we expect. He sent mine in a gray uniform with warm hands, and rice water, and a 7-year-old boy with a crayon drawing. When I had nothing left, no power, no voice, no movement, that is what found me. Not my empire, not my name on a building. This story, my story, is one of family betrayal, revenge in its rawest form. A son who wore my face and stole my name. A dad, revenge family, reckoning I never wanted but could not escape. If you have ever watched family betrayal, revenge tear through people you love, you understand that no amount of money insulates you from it. Family revenge does not announce itself. It grows quietly in the shadow of neglect. And dad revenge, family battles like mine are won. Not in courtrooms, but in the moment a father finally chooses to show up. If this story moves something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me whose hands have kept you warm when the world went cold. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because the stories that matter most are just beginning. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. A note. Before we continue, some stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely to illuminate truths worth examining. If that is not the journey you are looking for, no hard feelings. Choose what serves your soul. But if you are staying, welcome. The next story is already waiting.